What if helping children succeed wasn't just about academic support, but about teaching their brains how to think, plan, and manage emotions? Belinda Eddington from MindSpark joins us to unpack the power of executive functioning and how strengthening these skills can change outcomes for young people, especially those who are neurodivergent or have experienced trauma. If you work or care with children, this conversation will reframe how you understand behaviour, learning, and support. If you are caring for someone else, whether paid or unpaid, and no matter how many hours you do it, did you realise that you may be missing out on thousands of pounds of discounts for things that you may use every day? The Able to Care podcast is proud to be sponsored by the UK's #1 carers card. Started by two best friends who recognise that carers deserve better and are 100% committed to helping to change the lives of all carers and bringing them together as a strong community. Carers Card UK provides support, recognition and rewards. It offers reassurance by providing an ID card that helps access emergency information when needed, while also unlocking discounts, a wellbeing hub, a carers circle tool and a community through their app. All of this for less than the price of a box of chocolates a year. There are discounts on gym membership, days out, electrical goods, clothing and even glasses. Let others know you care while taking a little care of yourself with an ID card you can be proud of. Visit carerscarduk.co.uk/promo code/able to care today to order yours. Hello and welcome back to the Able to Care podcast. I'm your host, Andy Baker, and today we're diving into a topic that has the power to transform classrooms, families and futures: executive function. We're joined by Belinda Eddington, founder and managing director of MindSpark CIC, a social enterprise working across schools, organisations and communities to strengthen the skills children and adults need to manage their thoughts, emotions and actions. Belinda is a certified executive functioning coach with deep experience supporting neurodivergent individuals, including those with ADHD, dyslexia and autism. With a background in psychology, neuroscience and education, and fresh from her research into classroom-based interventions, she's here to help us understand what executive functioning is, why it matters, and how we can help young people build it for life. We'll be talking about self-regulation, metacognition, behaviour, coaching, and the role of relationships in helping children thrive. So whether you're a parent, teacher, carer, or just someone trying to better support young people in your life, this conversation will be packed with insights, compassion, and real-world tools. So, Belinda, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, brilliant. Well, thanks for that introduction. Yeah, just summarise, there's a lot there, but hopefully in our conversation we'll unpick some of those together.
Absolutely. And me and you have had a conversation a number of times, and we always go on for probably longer than we should, getting excited about something we're both very, very passionate about. And I always find, the insights that you give really valuable. So I'm excited today to kind of actually do it officially on the podcast and kind of share it with other people as well. So we'll dive straight into the kind of nitty gritty, because obviously I mentioned some bits there in the introduction that some people may not be familiar with. So for those who are new to the term, what exactly is executive function and why is it so central to how we learn, behave and relate to others?
Yeah, so executive function is a phrase that we do when we do training. Sometimes people haven't heard of the phrase, but as I describe it, it's something that we are dealing with all day, every day, both in our own lives through those we support, whether we're parents in schools or also, adults as well, supporting adults. So executive functioning are cognitive skills, so brain-based skills. And they are sort of our top-down control. So they help us manage our behaviour. They help us manage what we're focusing our attention and energies on. And they also help us sort of plan, organise, prioritise what we're going to do. And I think one way of thinking about it is they help us manage whatever we're focusing on in the present. So things like our working memory, managing our attention. But also they're really important of having a vision of the future, what we're going to do. So that sort of task, goal-directed behaviour. But also they help us bring in past experiences as well to support us. So they're sort of that that element of being conscious, being aware of our thoughts and having agency over our behaviors, actions and thoughts as well. And what's really interesting, a lot of this comes from research, like current research in understanding the brain. Previously we weren't able to see what really was happening in this amazing organ that we have, our brain. And it's just in, the last several decades that we can put people in fMRI scanners and actually watch, by the flow of oxygen in the brain, which areas are lighting up. So, yes, so there's a lot that we are learning about executive functioning and how we can support its development.
Absolutely. I think I often talk sometimes of like, do you think technology has moved on significantly in the last 10, 20 years? And obviously everybody's like, yeah, of course it has massively. So then I ask the question, do you think our understanding of psychology has also moved on in that time? And that's where I tend to get no. I was like, it has massively, like so much more understanding than we have. And more research and really grounded in evidence of, as you say, where the brain lights up and things like that. So you gave a wonderful description of that executive function there. I don't know whether you use the same analogy, but the conductor to the orchestra is often the analogy I use for that executive functioning area.
Yeah, there's some great analogies. The orchestra, I think, is a really good one. The conductor of an orchestra holding together all of these different parts that we do. There's another great example as well, thinking of an air traffic controller, sort of having that vital role to be directing, the planes as they arrive, but being organized, holding all that information in mind, but having that goal-directed behavior, learning, as I said, from past experience. So, yeah, there are some really fantastic analogies as well.
Now, it may seem fairly obvious as far as what you're talking about there, this kind of managing our emotions and being able to look into the past and the future and stuff. But I know that you talk about kind of its skills for life that you're looking to develop. The work that you do and the coaching that you do for helping young people is not just to help them in the here and now. It's something that actually they'll utilize throughout their life. And it's important in the earlier stages to develop it, the better the outcomes they'll get. But can you give some examples of how they show up in day to day as far as school, home, wherever?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we use a model actually based on Peg Dawson's work. So she's written some fantastic books called the Smart But Scattered series, and actually also an educator based in Canada, Laurie Faith, who's done some fantastic work in schools. And we use their model of 11 executive function skills. And so some of those are, I mentioned before, but sort of cognitive flexibility. So being able to adapt and change in the moment. And that's so important for problem solving. Or if you're solving a problem in one way, being able to go, actually, would a different way be better? You're going to have to be flexible with that. Or if plans change, how do you adapt to them? There's also working memory. So holding that information in mind. So you can think holding a phone number in mind or doing really simple mathematical arithmetic if you've got to hold those numbers and manipulate them. But that's also where you bring in previous experience as well and make sure that's accessible for how we're behaving. And I think in terms of how that might show up with a challenge, for example, with working memory, we know that children, sort of younger children, can only handle a small number or small bits of information. If you overload with lots of information, they just can't remember it all. And that happens for us. So I'm neurodivergent myself, dyslexic and strong ADHD tendencies. And, so my working memory, I know, is challenging. So I have to write things down. I find it very, very tricky to hold that information in mind. But also things like managing attention. So being able to focus on, the task at hand without getting distracted or pulled away. And so those are some of them. But again, organization. So we can, I'm sure all in our life, we know people who are much more organized or those who have challenges with their organization. That can be losing things if you're spending lots of time looking for your keys or bits of paper or, piles of things everywhere. And that also another one could be really important is time management and sort of how you manage your time. And, it's really interesting actually in psychology, you can look at how people have different time orientations. Some people are very focused on the now. And that would be, for example, a classic ADHD is there's only 2 time zones, now and not now. And, and there's lots of challenges, with that. But then some people really can see time in a much more almost linear way and are much better at anticipating what's coming up. We have other ones, sort of response inhibition or impulse control is really big. And that's that ability to just stop and pause before you say or do something. So having that, and when we're working with children, we quite often use the phrase, the power of the pause, sort of how you can have conversation with someone to be aware that the impulse control might be a challenge for them. So thinking about a strategy where they might just be able to just stop for a second before that impulse reaction happens. So those are some, but I mentioned there's also goal-directed persistence. So really the power of goal setting and looking into the future and then having what do you want to achieve. And that can be really important in coaching as well, because sometimes it's really easy to know what you don't want, but being able to look and plan what you do want. And back to you saying, how does that really support those skills for life? We know that a lot of these are the skills alongside the content that's being taught in the curriculum at school. Actually, these executive function skills not only support the learning, but they're also the skills that all employers want moving forward. They want someone who's, able to manage their emotions, their intentions, set goals, plan, prioritize. And it's really fundamental in building positive relationships is, having these executive function skills. And there's some really wonderful research. One of the big researchers in this area is Adele Diamond. And again, some fabulous work, available on sort of YouTube videos you can watch and research papers. And it's really showing that actually there's such a correlation with strong executive functioning and life outcomes in many, many different areas: academic, work-life outcomes, well-being, positive relationships, all link back to executive function skills. And we mentioned that ability to self-regulate, which is, so it's really important. And through conversations, you can build someone's understanding of their own profile, of what are their strengths or what areas might be challenging. And there's lots of really, again, positive research how you can do understanding neuroplasticity, which is a really, important area of, as we understand the brain more, we can see that actually the neural pathways are not fixed. And if you change your thought patterns and your actions, you actually strengthen new pathways that become their axon, the part of the cell, becomes strengthened. It develops a myelin sheath, and that becomes a faster, more preferential pathway. Well, I'm sure, Andrew, you probably read, the research there is on, the famous one is London taxi drivers, where they compared, the brains of London taxi drivers versus London bus drivers who drive the same amount on the London street, but the bus drivers would be going, from A to B and back and forth, whereas the taxi drivers had a whole different spatial awareness, knowing, the knowledge where they had to go to, and they could see the physical structures in the brain had changed.
I think that's a common misunderstanding, isn't it? So when we're looking at executive functioning, obviously that's one of the last part of the brain to fully mature in most individuals, which I think I've mentioned on the podcast before, obviously full brain maturation, or as you mentioned, related to the myelination of the neuron pathways at that point, is an average about 26, later for biological males and females. But obviously, and
neurodivergent individuals as well.
Absolutely. And that's it. So how do factors like stress, trauma, and neurodivergence all impact on that executive functioning?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because there are so many different factors. And actually, one thing we talk a lot about at MindSpark is the biopsychosocial model, because we find that really, really helpful to unpick what factors are at play influencing behavior in any given time. And so, first of all, genetics. is going to play a factor. And again, Andrea, we may have spoken about before, but thinking about twin studies is a really interesting way to be thinking about how much is nurture, how much is nature and nurture. And I think we all know it's not nature or nurture, it's nature and nurture. And I think, that's it. So genetics is really going to play a big part. And those twin studies where they compare twins, so identical twins who were raised in the same home environment and raised in different home environments. And then they compare fraternal twins who are the same genetic relations as siblings in same home environment and different. And as a rough rule of thumb, kind of comes up as 50% of the influence of any given trait comes from a genetic influence, and then 50% comes from a whole range of different other life experiences. And I think that was quite one thing to be aware of. So genetically, we might see similar profiles in our ability to self-regulate coming from our parents. Definitely true, talking about neurodivergence. So we're definitely, we can often see that where that might come from parental influences. And I think, that's another one, which really is going to be influencing executive function skills. So I think, for example, if we take dyslexia, so I'm dyslexic myself, and I think some of those executive functions are more challenging, such as working memory is very commonly associated with the dyslexia. Time management, also sort of organization kind of come there quite often with the dyslexia diagnosis. Thinking about ADHD. Now, ADHD, there's a fantastic, another psychologist and researcher, Russell Barkley, who does a lot of work on ADHD. And he has suggested that instead of calling it ADHD, it be better known as executive function deficit disorder. I probably could even come up with a better name that doesn't include the deficit, actually, because sometimes it's a regulation of attention rather than, for example, a deficit of attention. So, for example, there are lots of different presentations of an ADHD diagnosis, but quite often you're going to see sustained attention being a challenge, response inhibition or that impulse control, and emotional regulation, I think, is a really key factor, which quite often doesn't get addressed in places like, the diagnostic manual doesn't necessarily speak to those challenges with emotional regulation. And similarly, if we're taking someone who does have an autism diagnosis, for example, cognitive flexibility, as well as many of the other executive functioning can really be a challenge. So quite often the organization and time management, as well as that cognitive flexibility, are sometimes, linked. But so there's sort of the divergence. But if we going back to that biopsychosocial model, so the biology or the neurobiology would really speak to that genetics or perhaps neurodivergence. But anything in that neurobiology is everything physically in our body, from the chemical level of, for example, the chemicals that are in the synapses in our brain. So whether that is going to change our behavior on a chemical level, all the way up to a cellular level or systems level, our whole body, And I think if we're well rested, if we've eaten well, if we're healthy, that whole mind-body connection is all going to also be influencing our executive functioning. And then if we're using that model, if we're looking at the psycho bit is our psychology, which is our mind, our mindset, how we're feeling, what are our memories. And I think that's a really important aspect as well of what's going to be influencing us, our perception of events. And then I think really importantly, that social aspect. And that can be everything from relationships we have with our peers, with our parents, with our teachers, with those other important people in our world. And this, I'm talking about us, anyone who's listening to this, but also for any individual that we will be working with or supporting in many, many different contexts. And I think one thing, you mentioned trauma, and I think that's a really key part. If anyone has been had adverse childhood experiences. And I mean, that can happen in many ways. So it can be sort of really linked to poverty, sort of adverse conditions, but, any other traumas that could happen. I know we've spoken about those who've been adopted. That can also, those challenges in early years can have a lasting impact. And I think trauma is very interesting in terms of thinking about that biopsychosocial model, because if we're thinking about the social aspect, you can actually even think about transgenerational trauma and how that is going to be impacting the individual. And I think also there's a fantastic book, The Developing Mind by Dan Siegel. And I just think that's a really, really good read. And he talks a lot about how you can, of course, see how the brain, the neurobiology, is going to be impacting our psychology and our mind, and how we're feeling and acting and behaving is going to be influencing relationships. But I think what he brings in, which is very interesting, is a lot of research showing that actually relationships, it works the other way. Relationships, of course, influence our psychology, and those can have an impact on the physical structure of the brain as well. So there are loads that's sort of scratching the surface, but some of those ways that it really can be impacting executive functioning.
Absolutely. And there may be some people who are listening that can kind of maybe recognize the traits that you've mentioned and some elements of executive functioning difference in themselves, or it could be their children. You said, quite typical with those on the autistic spectrum is that inflexibility of thinking could be a real challenge for them. But this is the way you do things, and this is how things should have gone. Can be really difficult for them to see any other way of doing it. And there's two ways of looking at that to kind of go, well, this is who they are. Biologically, it's just who they are, and we should allow them to be whoever they are, which is, there's an element of, completely understand, and we do need to be accepting as a society. But it's also, however, it can be a really beneficial life skill to be able to then look at things from other points of view, to recognize that the one way you see it isn't the right way. It's just one way of looking at it. And that neuroplasticity that you've mentioned, that, as you said, biologically, they may have a predisposition for their brains to work this way, but it can be also an element of they can learn additional skills. They can learn either whether it be almost allowing their brain to make some reasonable adjustments as well as kind of practicing these other elements.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing. So whilst there is the aspect of sort of the neuroscience and the neuroplasticity, I think actually in a lot of work we do that can be really helpful is also the scaffolding and using strategies to help. So for example, if we're taking working memory, if working memory is challenging for someone such as myself, using ways to support that, whether that is writing notes, whether that is using, I'm a big believer in mixing both paper and digital. So sort of I will always have a notebook and be writing notes, but at the same time, I couldn't live without my digital diary, because there's something about it being able to sync with my computer and my phone and other people. So, for example, there's a lot of ways that we can support overcome challenges. And that's sort of the coaching ethos that can be used in like self-coaching, because I think this is really useful for us all to understand what might be our, play to our strengths and overcome our challenges by building that. We were talking about metacognition, that awareness of our thinking and thinking about thinking, and put strategies in place as well.
Yeah, I think it's that dialectic kind of thinking, isn't it? You are good enough the way you are, but there's also always room for improvement to make your own life easier and to achieve more and things like that. And I think it's that balance. It's not ever saying you're not good enough. It's saying that none of us are perfect, so we might as well grow and develop.
Yeah.
One of the things that we share in common in our kind of approach to kind of understanding people is, I know that rather you're looking at labeling or focusing on the behavior, you look at why is this happening? You go underneath. It's that being a better detective than judge. And I know you kind of mentioned that, shifting the mindset and over to that kind of thinking. Do you do it from a kind of when you're focusing on understanding a person's behavior, you tend to focus on it as far as an executive functioning kind of element to it, or is that how you kind of, that's your kind of focus?
Yeah, sort of how we say that. So we talk a lot about moving from the what to the why. Mm-hmm. So you can see the behavior, but how can we move away from that? And what might be influencing under the surface? And I'm sure many people here would have seen sort of behavior icebergs, and we very much think of that as a really nice analogy of what you're seeing above the surface. But it's about taking a non-judgmental approach to be looking what's beneath the surface. So could that be a challenge with cognitive flexibility? Could that be perhaps they haven't got very good systems to organize themselves, and that's a challenge for them? But also the emotional side, what would be going on if there is, an emotional aspect? Is it that managing their emotions is a challenge, or is there something else that could be going on, such as the trauma, such as, even on a day-to-day basis, even if we've got roughly a kind of our average executive functioning profile, even for all of us, we're going to have good days and bad days. If we haven't slept, if we're stressed, if we're, feeling undervalued, we do a lot of work where when we're working with teachers or professionals and parents who are supporting, individuals, getting them to think about themselves first and what might influence them if they were feeling overwhelmed. And sort of not being valued, can be a big part. So I think it really also speaks on the positive. What you can do about it is making sure people do feel that they belong, that they feel listened to, validated and heard, and having that relationship and connection is being a really important part of what can help them.
I think it's almost a bit of a catch-22 in some ways, isn't it? That you need a developed executive functioning skills to be able to recognize challenges in other people's executive functioning skills, and it's kind of a bit of a loop cycle on that, isn't it? That if I'm in a dysregulated state, so I'm in a heightened state of arousal, stressed, tired, then I'm not going to be able to recruit my conductor to be able to then look at, there's other ways of looking at this. I think, I hope you don't mind, I use an analogy I often kind of, to help people understand executive functioning, because most people, I think, have experienced a deterioration in their executive functioning when they've consumed alcohol. As an example, but you can kind of see all of those elements, that myopic thinking of I can only see the here and now rather than looking at the outcomes of the future. I can't focus on my goals. It's more about the enjoyment. Somebody bumps into me when I'm drunk. They did that on purpose. When I was on sober, it might be a case of maybe it's an accident, maybe they didn't see me. And it's all those, it's a kind of an extreme, it's an oversimplified understanding, but it gives people nobody would like to be to be judged as who they are or their abilities when they were drunk. But then we do that to other people, kind of, that was my difficulty or my challenges, my executive functioning, are the reason that maybe I struggle with working memory, that I'm a bit late on a meeting or whatever it is at times because of that. It's not doing it on purpose.
Yeah. Well, I think, a few things. Just thinking, I think when, if having a drink, what's happening is your response inhibition is really being lowered. And I think it touches on something when we're talking about self-regulation. You can have too much of an executive functioning. It is not as simple as just all executive functions are good. And I think there's a really great example if we think about, again, Dan Siegel, who's another fantastic psychologist who's written, I mentioned him earlier with the Developing Mind, but he sort of describes it. Imagine there's a little boat, a river, and we're in the middle of the river. And on one side, you've got sort of really, really flexible thinking. But if you go too far, actually it becomes chaotic. And it's like the bank of chaos. And then on the other side, if you've got sort of more structured thinking, which, lack of cognitive flexibility, but perhaps really organized and it can actually drift a bit to too much rigid thinking. And so, a little bit in the middle. And for example, when we are having fun, if we're in a concert, we want to let go and listen to music. Actually, you don't want too much self-regulation because you wouldn't be able to let go. And that probably is where that having a glass of wine actually allows us to be in the moment. But it's about having the right amount for the situation and the context that we're in. Because in work context or an academic context, or if we're doing things at home, actually we also want to be able to be focused on what we're doing, or the tasks.
Yeah, that's why a nice way of looking at it is almost the pros and cons. Because executive functioning is wonderful, but it's also what kind of almost beats us up after we've done something wrong and things like that. As far as the self-shame and things, pros and cons to everything that we have. So in what ways do you think building kind of executive functioning abilities kind of reduces things like, especially for children, things like exclusion, misunderstandings within school, or escalations in schools and care settings? How do you think it helps?
Yeah, I think it's sharing that lens. So we were talking about sort of an iceberg and this phrase of moving from the what to the why. I think in all individuals that we work with, and as I said, this is relevant to so many different areas. So we've worked with those sort of in sort of primary schools and nursery all the way through secondary schools. We're working with a number of universities and actually also with support workers who are supporting adults, particularly with an autism diagnosis. And, we do hear when we do work with them, it's having that compassion and seeing things differently. And I think you were speaking about being late, sort of rather than, someone doesn't care. They're just not late. Oh, well, maybe they've got some challenges with their time management or organisation or response inhibition, which might have got them distracted or sustained attention. And it really helps with that. We've got some wonderful partners that we've been working with in London, in Newham. And we've been working with a charity called Education for Change. And we've done a lot of work with a whole school called Kingsford. And actually we've worked with Kingsford, I'll use that as an example, but also we worked with the primary school Ruthven, where we've done a lot of whole school work. But in both of those, we've done whole school insets, and actually a number of their staff have been trained as executive function coaches. And so they really understand the methodology with that. And it's by seeing what's going on behind. So by being more supportive, so instead of instantly talking about that blame or shame, using an executive function language can be really helpful as they talk to the individual child who might be struggling. Because instead of saying, for example, you were impulsive, or why did you do this? It's let's unpick it together. Let's take a step back. What's going on for you? Asking lots of open questions, being really curious what's going on for them. And then through those conversations, seeing how they can build an understanding of themselves, how the school environment could support them, and then also what strategies that young person can put in place for themselves. And that, and I think also having an understanding of what might have gone on for them. So was there trauma, adverse childhood experiences, what's gone on? And it helps that understanding to put it in context. And I think what we find as well is once you have that, because of the strategy and sort of the goal setting and the coaching, it helps you with the understanding, but also starts showing some steps that can be taken to help that individual, but really bespoke to them what they might like to try to do differently.
Have you ever encountered an adult or child's behaviour that has felt difficult, overwhelming, or challenging? Have you sometimes felt at a loss of what to do, or know that you didn't handle it quite right? People are complex and unpredictable, and their behaviour can be like the weather. We've all made the mistake of looking out the window and feeling safe to wear shorts, but 5 minutes later wishing for an umbrella. But what if, like a weatherman, you understood how humidity, temperature and pressure all come together to cause the weather, allowing you to better prepare, predict and respond, and prevent ever having a picnic ruined by a thunderstorm ever again? My book, called Targeting the Positive with Behaviours that Challenge, helps you to become the weatherman of behaviour. It provides you with a toolkit to increase competency, confidence, resilience and empathy, so you feel more assured about how to respond to distressed or dysregulated behaviours in others, including those affected by trauma, mental health neurodiversity, learning disabilities, or dementia. Build better connections, achieve de-escalation, and improve outcomes for yourself and those you engage with my celebrated 6-stage target model, a step-by-step process to reduce distress for everyone. Discover my empowering, person-centered guide in Targeting the Positive, written by me, Andy Baker, available from online bookstores worldwide. Find a link in the description and order today. I take it when you're doing the executive coaching and things like that. So there has to be an element of mindset for the teachers themselves. I'm just thinking of an example there as far as, so let's say if I became emotionally overwhelmed or dysregulated in a situation, I was maybe felt I was struggling to manage my temper, or something was annoying me and I was getting myself worked up. And I might go, do you know what? I need a minute. And I remove myself from the situation and I go and calm myself down and I kind of reanalyze it and go, okay, I was getting emotional, but I need to look at this from different points of view and things like that. So I'd hopefully go away and re-regulate myself and then be able to go back into the situation with this better understanding and a calm state. Right. Yeah. Fantastic. Perfect. Very well done, me as an adult. If you put then a child in a school where they're getting really irritated and angry with the teacher, sometimes those same methodologies that we consider to be respected and almost positive from an adult, then sometimes would be inhibited to allow them to do that for a child, where stepping away and, the teacher, yeah, but you're doing this now and you do as you're told. Do you have to help the teachers to kind of almost allow the strategies and be more accepting of those strategies?
Exactly. I mean, it's all a process. And I think it's about having almost like a slight culture shift when we're working with organizations. And all organizations we work with, it's all very bespoke because you are talking about a cultural change. So it's about sharing the understanding and making it accepted to support. And it's, like thinking, about how, I mean, one thing, I don't know if any of your previous guests have spoken about the hand model of the brain. Is that something that...
I don't think we have. Yeah, I'll see where the amygdala and the executive function side. Yeah. But by all means, go through it again.
So again, this is another one of Dan Siegel's, he's a genius taking really complex neurobiology and turning them into a relatively simple model. And he does say this is very oversimplified of the brain, but he said if you need, there's loads of videos as well you can watch. But if you take a brain and you imagine that this is your prefrontal cortex just here behind your forehead, and if you are triggered emotionally or that response inhibition, it's almost like you flip your lid. And he describes it that, here you've got your emotional centers, that amygdala here, and here's your thinking brain, the upstairs brain. And actually the neural circuitry is totally different. It totally bypasses the prefrontal cortex, and you don't have access to those all important skills to help you regulate. And also in a famous book, The Body Keeps Score, Bessel van der Kolk, he also describes it in a slightly different way, which I think is very interesting. He's sort of saying, if you're looking out for danger, which is what we are genetically designed to survive and look out for danger, it's almost like here's like a watchtower. It's very thoughtful. We're scanning the horizon, and we can take really measured responses to avoid danger. Whereas if you have flipped your lid and you're here in this downstairs brain, so it's more like a smoke alarm. It's either safe or danger. And it's very, very binary. And I think that's an important part of an understanding that we can share. So if someone is triggered, that's not the time to be having a conversation where you're going to unpick what's going on for them. It's a different type of response. And I think we can think about this with young children, but it's all the way up, how we'd respond differently in the moment, particularly if emotions and tempers are heated. And that's where that self-regulation would be to take a step back. But I think we can notice that. And one of the strategies we talk about as well is actually an extension of that. Instead of thinking of it flipping the lid, you can actually see if you can notice if someone's lid is about to flip and it kind of goes to a C for caution. If you can see that, actually, are there any strategies we can do before the lids just to stay regulated? And that could be as simple as movement breaks or, making sure children have a run around at playtime, or, take those breaks, but having that self-awareness as well. But there's lots, if you can bring in that culture of talking about executive functioning, self-regulation, metacognition across the school, in a classroom, and also you're not singling out any children who might have more pronounced challenges or perhaps are neurodivergent. You're actually working within the whole classroom to help build on this. And great examples of how in teachers they could be bringing strategies and in the classroom as well. And then that kind of addresses that if you have that culture, then you can start noticing when people might be triggered. And there's lots of really exciting ways where you're almost sort of bringing in aspects of that coaching within a classroom culture, supporting self-regulated learning, as well as those all-important skills for life.
I love that. And I think one of the things that I was just thinking about as you said that when I'm teaching certain subjects, I always use this as an example. Obviously, doing what I do and studying what I've studied, and we've got, even though different routes too, we've got a kind of similar aim to some degree or another. One thing that's helped me is because I have been studying it, I have been looking at it, it's constantly in the forefront of my mind as far as this being a detective rather than judge, connection before correction, all of the kind of the elements that I do. And because it's forefront of my mind, it allows me to access it more effectively. And I think what I love about your kind of model and what you do with MindSpark CIC is you're kind of almost teaching people to think in that same way, that if you're constantly being mindful of why the students might be acting that way, then that forces you to do it to yourself a little bit more, which allows you to then better regulate, to better cope, to be able to find other strategies, because you're more likely to be role modeling. And the fact that you're looking, well, I've got to teach you how to do it. For me to teach you how to do it, I've got to be able to do it myself. And that brings that in. So I really like the aim that you kind of do with that, with the coaches within schools.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I might mention that with our model, we do have, and it really speaks to that sort of connect before correct, mindset. So we have 4 phases when we talk about our coaching. That first one, really importantly, is connection, and it's building rapport. And I think a lot of us in this world, if we're in helping careers or jobs or drawn to this, we sort of innately so often do have that desire and want to be building empathy and rapport. And I think it's, even though we might be doing it, it's about just being very aware that we are making sure we make those connections first. And we were talking about makes someone, the more safe they are, they're more likely to be regulated, to be open-minded. The next stage after we have built that connection and rapport and communicated empathy is really to talk about curiosity. And I think that's such an important word. It's really what's going on for that individual. And it's curiosity that sometimes the individual hasn't necessarily thought of it themselves. So you're almost bringing up metacognition, thinking about what's going on, but remaining curious as a helping individual, as a coach or as a teacher, or, and being curious about what's going on, because everyone has a different model of the world, and listening and using lots of open-ended questions and reflective listening, and really being non-judgmental and open-minded on what you're hearing coming back. And then it's only once you've kind of gone through those phases do you bring in any probably more traditional coaching, where you'd start thinking, okay, well, what can we do about it? What can we do differently, and what would be realistic to change? And are there any strategies that could help you develop that? So kind of bring that. And importantly, we then have a fourth phase, because we know a lot of these things are cyclical. It's all iterative. It might not be just the first time and everything's going to be sorted. It's an ongoing process. So being there and reflecting on which aspects did work well, what strategies did work. Sometimes an important role of these conversations is someone might want to make huge changes, but actually as a helping adult or as a coach, it's about making sure that they're realistic, because you also don't want to set someone up to fail by giving themselves too big a goal. So it's bringing those conversations in with the reflection. So that's sort of how it all weaves in together. But yeah, it really responds to that sort of connection is so important.
Yeah, it is. I think it's so easy sometimes to kind of focus on. I heard it actually. I've heard it quite recently. I was attending a course for foster parents, and I heard some of them talking about the children's behaviour beforehand, and I found it quite interesting thing that I've tried to move away from a little bit, but I hear it a lot. A lot of parents and a lot of people, you'll hear them narrating on their behaviour. So they were sort of saying, "Well, how are these kids getting on in your household?" Said, "Yeah, their behaviour's really good." And I found that quite odd, because I was thinking it's all focused on the behaviour. What I'd really love to be hearing is they seem really happy. We're really building positive connections. I feel like we're developing some trust. But it was all about how good their manners were, how good the regulation was, how good and it was just a little bit of focus on the behaviour, which is the surface. Again, like you use the iceberg, they're focusing so much on the surface of the iceberg rather than going underneath the water and going, because if they focused on, they seem really happy, they wouldn't need to be commenting on the behaviour, because happiness would lead to, yeah. And it's quite interesting. I think people's narratives sometimes, it's almost shifting it. You've got to start talking about all the time, making it a habit to talk what's below the water rather than on the top of the water.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, because a lot of the work we're doing is, if someone identifies a challenge, it's about helping them with a strategy to overcome that challenge. At the same time, it's really important to remember the strengths and use a strength-based model. And in fact, there's a great questionnaire which you can track. I don't know if you've ever done it. It's the VIA Strengths Questionnaire, which is it's a really good one. Anyways, we sometimes use that about different values that come up. And in fact, a friend introduced me to that, and it's lovely. It's like, what are your strengths? Do it come up? Could be wisdom or knowledge or resilience. Like, what are the values that drive you? And they can be really useful to bring those kind of conversations alongside what we are talking about, where someone might have a challenge with their executive functioning. But even using sort of the EF language, someone, for example, might be really organized, have really good time management, really good goal-directed behavior, but it might be, for example, in that their flexibility might be challenging. If they're kind of going a little bit to that tendency towards rigid thinking, but then it's sort of working out how can they play to their strengths, but, make steps to overcome any challenges. And I think this is where it can be really useful, understanding colleagues as well, or understanding other people in our life, our partners, our others in our family. And I'll give you an example, colleagues working, that I'm working with, I can be aware that I'm sort of more that sort of, I've got good flexibility, but sometimes the organisation and the time management could be better. And I mentioned working memory. And, I've one of my fantastic colleagues is absolutely amazing, organised, but sometimes the cognitive flexibility can be a challenge. So as we work, we understand each other's, ways of working better. And sort of, I know that I have to be, make sure that I'm really clear and organised on any expectations that I have. And again, it's just understanding each other better. We can work out how we can best support and communicate with others.
Yeah, so it's managing expectations both about yourself and about others, isn't it? At that particular point, that which again is all this part of the brain required to be able to do that and kind of reflect on it. So you recently conducted some research in year 5 and 6 classrooms. So what were some of your key findings, and what do you think it means for education moving forward from the stuff you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, so we did. I did a recent master's at Birkbeck, and I was really fortunate that my supervisor allowed me to write my dissertation on some of our active action research that we were doing through MindSpark. So yeah, I did compare it was a 2-form entry school, and I worked with 2 of the teachers in year 5, 6, and the other 2 were our control group. And I then did work with them afterwards. So I think there's sort of good ethical considerations there as well, that at the end, all of the teachers had received some training. And I think within that, whilst it was a relatively small study, we did see over that period that we used a measure that actually captures the number of challenges. And actually, over time, it did decrease over the 2-term intervention. The self-reported challenges had decreased. I did also do mixed measures. So I also had semi-structured interviews. And I think it was really useful, hearing how the teachers found that language very beneficial to be discussing this across the whole school. Interestingly, I was talking about the model of flipping the lid and sort of the caution zone. One of the teachers actually said they found that useful in managing the whole classroom of 30 children, not just as an individual. He could see when the energy was rising and using that, as a collective understanding of managing a classroom energy as well. I think there were lots of examples as well of, because these EF skills and strategies were talked about a lot in the classroom. So it was about working, for example, one child was having trouble, so working on their time management, but having bespoke conversations with different pupils. So, and then coming up with, I'd like to try a timer. But actually, it was the buy-in from the student, because, and this is really important, these strategies are not, okay, I've got, must follow this strategy. What makes it really powerful is if you can get the individual to say, I want to try this strategy, and then they put that in place. So she was sharing, that one was a timer, but then there was another child that a timer would have made them really anxious. So for that child, actually, that was not the right strategy. And so it wasn't. There was just the teacher would give a gentle prompt. And actually, talking about prompting, they were trying loads of things. So actually pairing students who had a strength and a challenge sitting next to each other. So actually empowering a child who was really good at task initiation, getting started on tasks, sitting next to a child who found that a little more challenging. So almost like a nudge partner, she was calling it. And I think there were really discussions of using the executive function literacy, so naming the executive function skills and those strategies being spoken about. So it was promising to see more. We've also done actually a whole school approach also in Rathfern. And again, very similar outcomes of how over time you can begin to get this language, and just seeing children understanding themselves more and linking it across different areas of the curriculum. And I think we also bring in metacognitive talk. So you were mentioning saying things out loud and that modeling, but actually things that might be so obvious for us to do as adults, we don't realize actually, but just talking it through step by step. And that's really helpful for particularly parents of, young children, but all the way through, if you're actually speaking out loud about what you've done and why you've done it, that can be really helpful building that metacognition.
You mentioned quite a few times throughout the talk, the conversations that you are having, and it's a lot about, it sounds like you're really arming adults and the children themselves as part of the coaching to improve the way they communicate about how they're feeling, about their thoughts, about what they're finding difficult and challenging, or their own understanding, or maybe in exploring how other people are experiencing it and stuff as well. Would you say that's kind of, is that fundamental to what you do, would you say, as far as the coaching process is concerned?
Yeah, I think it is. It's about through conversation, helping people to change and grow. And a lot of our work is very evidence informed, sort of both in terms of the neuroscience, what's going on in the brain. In our classroom work, we build a lot on work, that's already been done in self-regulated learning and metacognition. It's a great way. It's about how can we make thinking visible? And it's the language and the conversations that help that. And I think just talking as well about, sort of some of our coach training, actually we build on motivational interviewing, which I know we've spoken about in the past and I know you've done, but bringing in some of those skills about how through conversation you can help someone, have that motivation to change. So we build in so motivational interviewing, also the stages of behavior change, which again, I think we've spoken about in the past. Like, where is someone? Are they ready to change? We can bring in the idea of mindsets. So obviously a lot of work in schools, talk about growth mindset and how do we have that power of yet? Like, I can't do it yet. Whereas what we can do, and I really think, is by understanding the brain and the neuroscience and neuroplasticity, it's almost like the science behind a growth mindset. And that can help us really build on it, and it becomes really empowering for children to understand what is going on and sort of realize that there is some agency to change.
Yeah. I find it so fascinating. There's so many elements to this that I'm just thinking there's other stuff that I do outside of the care work and behavior work I do. So much of what you're saying is also a lot of the stuff that I do in my kind of business mentoring side of things when I'm coaching entrepreneurs to improve their outcomes and to better build their business. And you mentioned it earlier, as far as the life skills are concerned, that these skills that, you've kind of worked and helped to develop this coaching practice for kids to develop are also the ones that employers, or to be successful in business generally, are really important for. It's all that kind of self-regulation, goal setting, being able to focus on one thing at a time rather than necessarily multitasking. But sometimes that flexibility to be able to go multitasking sometimes a little bit more appropriate in that moment, or switching your focus as you need to and stuff are so important to what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. As in the past, I've sort of pulled up, if you the jobs sort of gone through CVs and you see what people are putting on CVs, and it is so much is managing time. I stick to a task until I've finished it. I'm good working relationships. I'm really organized. And actually so many of those are the skills. Ability to problem solve in the moment. I can overcome obstacles that come my way. Like, all of these things are so important. That independent working, all of the things are so vital to be supporting, as I said, academics and preparing children for the workplace, or supporting adults who are already in the workplace.
So for teachers, caregivers who are listening right now, what's the best way for them to start developing executive functioning in those that they're supporting? Obviously, we'll come on to working with you in a moment, but as far as tomorrow.
I mean, I'm thinking, there's something, it's sort of a balance. And I guess this is relevant for parents and teachers. And actually, there's sort of a model that we've developed as well. But if you think about kind of this, say, coaching approach, is a balance between having really high expectations or being very directive. This is the way you must do what I want. Or then you can almost, on the other end of the spectrum, have someone who's very, really nurturing, perhaps protective, perhaps doing it for someone. So really they're supportive. And I think it's about almost being aware of where are you in that almost spectrum. And if we think about a sort of a coaching or a mentoring approach being in the middle, sometimes you might need to be a bit more directive with something. Sometimes you might really need to be that supportive. But if you can keep high expectations for yourself, clear with the boundaries, clear, again, we were talking about that communication, and sort of to scaffold enough, but not too much. Be clear about what your expectations are, but don't be too directive. And it's sort of that model. I'm sure you will have come across the 4 parenting styles, sort of Diana Berriman's, and it's sort of very much talking about that. So in her model, there is the authoritarian, which is the very, very directive approach. And then for that very kind approach, she's got the empathetic. So that very kind. And really what we want is, in her language, she calls it the authoritative. But I really think using that language of being a coach or being a mentor is really what you're doing. You're scaffolding that individual, but for self-efficacy, that in the long run, they're going to be able to do it themselves. But by being aware of what challenges, what's appropriate, challenging them to the right amount, that it's not overwhelming for them, but also not that you're doing it for them. So I think that's sort of a little aspect where I think we can be. And the other thing is, often say these conversations, you don't know which is the conversation that is going to sow the seed of when it's going to land and make a difference. So so we call them coaching conversations. They can happen in so many different contexts. You don't know if it's not just in sort of a more formal coaching session. It could be, we've heard stories of teachers supporting a child who was upset as they were waiting for the lunch queue. And actually it was just a kind conversation, validating what went on, supporting them in the moment, that really made a difference. So sorry, I snuck in 2 bits there.
That's okay. It was really good. And I think that's one of the things that I did pick up on as you were kind of talking about, the methodology and stuff. It is very coaching orientated. It isn't kind of lecturing, teaching, hey, this is what you should or shouldn't do. And I think you gave a wonderful example in there as you were talking, the child that chose going, hey, I think a timer would help me, is so important, but maybe not in line with how some people feel that children should be managed. And it's shifting that mindset as well, isn't it? That they are more autonomous and more able than maybe we give them credit for. And therefore they can choose that path themselves. But, and you mentioned the cycle of change there, but at the right point in the cycle of change. It's like, I often use the analogy around the cycle of change that some people would like going on a diet or quitting smoking. Like nobody goes on a diet if they don't see a problem with their weight. But then it's about them finding, if you're just telling them you should do the Atkins diet or you should do this diet, that's not going to help them to make that change. It's guiding them to see maybe what diet's going to work for them and how they're going to apply it and how they're going to kind of bring that in life and ease them into it in a way that's right for them. Yeah.
Yeah. And actually there's thinking back to sort of some of the wider research on executive functioning by Adele Diamond and others. A lot of the research is about how, if you can support executive function skills, it's actually making sure that they are then transferable. So there's a question called near transfer and far transfer. And for example, they're saying some sort of cognitive training where you might be using an online game, you might be able to train and improve your working memory or improve something, but it's not necessarily transferable. So you might improve your working memory when you're playing that game. So that would be an example of near transfer. Whereas the approach of bringing this into conversations and testing and supporting different aspects of executive functioning in the context where you want to use it, be that in school, at home, in the workplace, and testing it in lots of different ways and those strategies, you are increasing the wide transfer. And I think this is really important when we are supporting someone and thinking about goal setting and thinking about change and what strategy can be put in. Actually, you're empowering them because they're going to learn that strategy works. So in a different context, maybe I could try the same. So, for example, a timer is a relatively simple strategy, but it's about someone going, I want to try something different because I think that could help. And maybe I could use that in another situation or something similar. It kind of lays a foundation for change in other aspects as well.
Definitely. So obviously we've spoken around a little bit what we do. So how can people find out more about you and the services that you offer and access the incredible coaching training that you do?
Oh, yeah. I mean, as I said, we do our coaching we have a 6-week program, which is online. So we have lots of people who join us from various different organizations, both schools, we have professions, we have done some wonderful work with youth clubs. So those are youth work is really useful. And we've actually also been doing a project in Wales with support workers who are working with adults who have autism. So yeah, all of our information is available on our website, which I think you'd be putting a link somewhere. We've got, we have our next course is starting on the 14th of October. Then after that, we have another one in February and then again in May. And as I said, it's 6 weeks, 3 hours a week. And then we also are very excited in the last year, we've developed a peer-to-peer coaching as well, which is really helpful in addition to the course with us, actually continuing to practice those coaching skills. So, so that's sort of our model, but we do use that as well, as you've been speaking about, in schools as well. And also that, I'd be delighted to talk to anyone about how we could work with your school or organisation, and said really making it bespoke for each individual organisation is how it really, that's how you have that meaningful change. And on our website, we've got lots of research reports that we've done. As I said, we're very evidence informed. We're a research driven organisation. We did mention we're a social enterprise as well. So whilst we work with a wide range of organisations, we really have a strong social purpose, making sure that all of this understanding really reaches those who are overcoming adversity. Now, I mentioned the schools we're working with in Newham, also putting in a really exciting project of possibly delivering, if we're successful, executive function coaching in Southwark through communities there. But yeah, that's our program is, all the details on the website.
Awesome. And is there stuff available for parents as well? Obviously, is there stuff available?
So we are building, at the moment, a lot of our work for parents, we do deliver through our partner organisation. So it is something we're looking at building more. As I said, if anyone joins our mailing list, we quite often include a podcast. I know you've met one of my other, one of the co-founders, Bettina Honan, who's a clinical psychologist. She's incredible. So we quite often share some of her podcasts, which are really fantastic. So we do include support for parents, and what we know is really, really valuable for parents. But at the moment, the main activities come through our partnerships with organisations. But in the future, as we grow, it's definitely something we would like to build more, supporting parents directly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Belinda. I knew this was going to be a fantastic conversation. So it was great to have you on. And finally, it feels like a time before we've managed to get, it's like both such busy people. It's been difficult to get together, but it was definitely worthwhile. So thank you so much for your time.
Oh, well, it's brilliant. As I said, it's an absolute pleasure. I said, it's always, I think you're right, how you introduced it. We've had some really fantastic conversations. Like, we should have been capturing this. So it's been really wonderful to be able to capture it. And so thank you very much for the opportunity.
My pleasure. So for anybody listening, if you found anything that we've spoken about interesting, useful, or you feel there is people out there who need to hear this message as well, because there is so many teachers, parents, caregivers, professionals who I know want to do really well by the children they're supporting, but maybe don't know how. And it is projects and community, social enterprises like Belinda's that can make a real difference and improve the quality of lives, not just for the children, but also for them as adults, as well as for the adults themselves. So do like, share, and comment, or seek out and check the notes, the description, to find out more about how you can contact Belinda. But otherwise, thank you very much.